Welcome back to another episode of Eavier than Metal. Today we are going to paint the Crimson Fist Space Marine. If you're new to the series, my goal is to paint the miniature to the highest possible standard that I can fit into 20 hours or less. I'm going to explain everything I do in great detail, and I will show you all the tricks that I'm using. That said, of course, cramming 20 hours into less than 40 minutes, which is already 10 times the average view time a video gets on YouTube, means I can show you everything down to the last brush stroke. So if you're interested in learning more about the techniques used in this video, there's always the option to join my Patreon, which allows for a more lecture style, longer video format. I did indicate the parts that became Patreon tutorials in the video. One thing I want you to do right now is pause the video, go to the comments and tell me what you want to see painted up for the next video. I'm going to paint the model which gets the most mentions if we can get to 100 comments in the first 24 hours. So whatever you always wanted to see painted up to a decent standard, maybe to have a video about to paint along with, this is your chance. Of course, we have to stay reasonable. I'm definitely not going to paint the Keeper of Secrets in 20 hours or less. You crazy bastards. Enjoy the video, and if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments section and I'll answer every single one of them. I didn't really want to paint another bolter, so I did a little surgical procedure and switched it out for a plasma rifle. I went ahead and primed the model and started on the base coat, which was a mix of Deep Sea Blue and Brionne Blue by Reaper. But if you want to use Games Workshop colors, just start off of Cantor Blue and mix in a bit of Incubate Darkness if you want it darker.
3 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
And yes, now's the time to go to the comment section and tell me how much of a dork I am for not using an airbrush at least for a base coating. I added a lighter blue for the initial layers of highlights, in my case a mix of Reaper, Cyan Blue and Sky Blue. I added a lighter blue for the initial layer of highlights, in my case a mix of Reaper, Cyan Blue and Sky Blue. Again, if you want to use Games Workshop colors, just use Calgar Blue or something a little darker for a smaller step in value. What I'm doing is define the volumes of the armor. It's going to be reflective, so all my shapes will be defined like reflective cylinders, spheres and planes with secondary reflections. All shapes I refine will have larger reflections and a secondary reflection. Additionally, I am putting in highlights on the edges, even on the ones facing down, but they won't be as intense as the ones facing up. Again, a secondary reflection on this large cylinder, on the leg, primary and secondary, edges. I decided to define a complete leg as far as values go, so that I have a reference for all the other areas. and then continue gradually highlighting them up by adding more and more of the lighter color. I'm covering less and less area with every lighter layer, but I'm sticking to the patterns: primary, secondary reflection, edges. Edges that are facing up I'm defining even more, typically more opaque in the middle or whatever is the culmination point of light, and then fading them out. I'm adding a bit of wolf grey by Vallejo Game Color for the next highlight. This is when the armor starts to get the slight metallic touch, the slight metallic feel that I wanted to achieve, as you can see. On spherical shapes I paint a larger upper primary reflection, but I also make sure they have a bounce light in the lower section. They are divided by a visible shade in the lower third, as you can see. Edge highlights, again, are important. Edges are where light collects and reflects, and we want to give them the attention that they deserve. Even on darker armor, I typically go pretty high in value for my highlights. You also saw that in the episode about the Black Templar Captain. Just always make sure the color still reads as black, dark blue or red, but contrast is your friend in miniature painting. I also paint the backpack. You can see the focus on edges and the high contrast it adds. I wanted to see how true metallic gold would look in combination with this reflective armor, so I painted the chest eagle with scale color golds. However, I thought it looked a bit weird and decided to repaint it red later. Which means the footage won't have any relevance here, but I decided to turn it into a tutorial for my Patreon and I made it available at the $2 pledge level. This is a good opportunity to see how you like the Patreon format if you were unsure about whether to join or not. Speaking about contrast, my shade color is Nightshade Purple, which I mix into the base tone. I don't believe in magical colors that will make everything better, but I'm also lazy and this color works pretty good as a shade for a lot of colors. Not only blue, also red, for example. For the reds, I decided to go with Reaper Clothed Red. If I had to use a Games Workshop color, I would probably use Mephiston Red mixed with black. I'm highlighting the red with Wolf Grey by Vallejo Game Color. This is a cold color tone because I want the same metallic sheen and feeling to the red that I have in the blues. In my head this is colored metal and not a paint job, and that's why I want that metallic feeling to it that I have in the blues. Highlighting all the volumes according to their shape type. For example, the fingers get parallel reflections because they are cylinders. On the trims I'm picking spots that I feel would directly reflect light onto an onlooker and slowly highlight these further. On the lower side I actually feel like I should have highlighted the trim a bit more in line with the blue, but hindsight is 20/20 of course. I'm shading with a mix of clothed red and black. Now it also was time to redo the eagle. Like I said, I just didn't quite like how the reflective armor and the true metallics interacted. I started again with a base of clothed red and gradually highlighted it by mixing in Ice Yellow by Vallejo Model Color just to see how a warm highlight color would look against the coal of the trim to increase the contrast. To increase the contrast, I washed the recesses carefully with black in order to not lose saturation completely, because that's what black does. For the rifle I used scale color heavy metal. I really like their metallics because of the fine pigments. As you can see, the paint goes on a little bit hard on the base coat, but eventually I had a covering layer. Slowly adding layers of Games Workshop's Bad Up Black wash. I wanted a really gritty and grimdark look because even though the Primaris are supposed to wear top of the line gear, I like the thought that the plasma technology is very archaic and raw, and this dirty black was supposed to add to the look. Highlighting the edges with heavy metal and putting in thin lines and scratches to simulate wear. After that, I added some washes of Teflon mud to make the rifle look slightly brown to increase the gritty effect even more. Then I re-added some of the highlights that got lost and another layer of scratches through thin lines of very thin down mechanics. This is to simulate older and fresher scratches and wear. To mimic a glowing plasma effect, I started with a mix of clothed red and troll slayer orange. There's multiple approaches to simulate plasma glow, but this is a quick and easy one. I cover everything with one layer and make sure the higher up areas still have a bit of the black base coat shining through. These will become the cooler areas. Then I add a second layer and make sure it sticks to the recesses more to not ruin the effect. I'm gradually adding pure orange and more white to the layers, and I'm covering less area with them too. This looks like there is hotter material in the center and everything cools more towards the outside. For the pouches and the holster, I decided to just go for black, highlighted in a gray that I just mixed out of black and white. I picked out the edges with semi-transparent layers and cleaned up some of them with thin coats of black where needed. I also worked on the areas between the armor plates. I mixed the blue-gray and applied the first layer, only touching the top of the elements. Since they are rounded, I pick a spot and arrange the highlights so they look like a group of reflections that run vertically. To increase the contrast, I'm picking out the shadows again with pure black. The last step was to pick some reflections out with white, and all areas that turned out too grey, I gave a layer of black to darken them again. In order not to introduce too many new colors, I used the same orange for the little screen and the buttons on the ARM console. Making sure the upper half stays darker, I'm starting with a mix of clotted red and orange again. I'm highlighting the edges with orange, and like you would paint a gemstone, I highlight the area towards the downward facing corner. Adding some flat flash for a bit less saturated reflections and highlights. And a bit of ice yellow to add the quadrant lines. A bit of white for the total reflections on the very edges. I base coated the helmet with the same colors I used for the armor. I decided to paint the lieutenant pattern on, even though I know, it's an ultramarine pattern, but guess what? I don't care. highlighted the shapes accordingly, and I really love sharp edges like these on the face mask because they make for such dramatic contrast. Deciding that the markings would be a paint job compared to actual colored alloys on the armor, I added scratches and wear. You can find a full tutorial about this helmet and the weathering process on my Patreon. Putting in the finishing touches on the helmet, I painted the piping in heavy metal by scale color, leaving out the recesses and dividing lines so the black base coat shows through. This saves me the hassle of having to shade and re-highlight the metal. At this point I also painted the exhaust vents on the backpack, again starting with a base of heavy metal and then shading in a mix of battered black and black. I softened the gradient by glazes of speed metal by scale color. Using the same colors I used for the eagle, I highlighted up the grading on the backpack. Adding sharp edge highlights here makes for a very dramatic effect. Really like how that turned out. Another thing left to do was the lenses of the helmet. I like to do most of the details on a miniature in the same color because that keeps it coherent, so I use the same reds and oranges again. Last, I added white dots in the opposite corner of the highlights to mimic the sunlight reflecting. I wanted to make a base that was combining different shapes, in this case irregular rocks with a monolith-like element that had very sharp, regular edges. I started off by bulking the shapes out with cork and then put it on milliput to be able to put in textures. I'm using super glue because the milliput doesn't really stick to the dry and dusty surface of the cork too well. To texture the rocks, I took a blister sponge that I pressed into the fresh milliput and I twisted it in different ways to create additional cracks and random effects. After I sandpapered the monolith part flat and made sure all angles were sharp, I base coated it black and gave it a grey driver's layer. I don't like grey all too much for rocks, but it helped with defining the shapes and added some texture. Using my newly acquired Liquitex inks, I started tinting the grey with sienna and umber hues. To make the base more interesting, I made sure the contrast of the edges versus the surface was high, and I also added a warm, cold contrast by adding turquoise texture on top of the more orange-red base color. To distinguish the rocks from the monolith, I reintroduced some red and highlighted it with a warm yellow. You can see the whole painting process on my Patreon. I used pigments to simulate dust and sand collecting in the rocks and cracks of the rocks. Using Vallejo Air Black, I cleaned up all the edges of the black base. Now it was time to watch it all come together, so I glued on the helmet and glued the miniature to the show base. There's something immensely satisfying about this process. I also glued the hand to the model and added the backpack. After finishing the hand that is holding the rifle, the only detail left to do was the purity seal, and I just used Vallejo's English uniform and highlighted it by gradually adding more ice yellow. For the wax part of the Purity Seal, I took the black base coat as a shadow color and just added 2 highlights with Clothed Red and Mephiston Red. And here's the final result. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching, thanks for all the support, and thanks a lot to my patrons. You guys are the reason I can do what I do.